Hi everyone. This lecture is about neoliberalism. So neoliberalism is another of the key concepts that you'll be working with throughout this year. So it's important to try and get a good handle on it. So we've already looked at two key concepts, ableism and disableism. In this session, we look at neoliberalism, and then in the final lecture in this kind of set, we'll sort of try and bring them all together into what Dan Goodley calls neoliberal ableism. Okay, so if we focus now on this concept of neoliberalism. So the first thing to understand is that neoliberalism is an ideology. Now, this is a word that you may have heard, but might not be totally sure what it means. So I'm going to tell you what I think it means. And it's quite simple. An ideology is a set of beliefs that guides the way that we think and act, right? An ideology is a set of beliefs that guides the way we think and act. The thing about neoliberalism is that it's an ideology which has become incredibly dominant and influential. So it started as a set of ideas way back in the 1950s about how economies should run. But over the decades, what has happened is that it has become an ideology which is so powerful that it in fact influences the way that we think about people, the dominant way that we think about people, and even about education, and even about disability. So that's why we're going to spend time on it now. So what is this set of beliefs and all about? Well, if we break the word down, neoliberalism, we end up with new freedoms, right? Neo means new, and liberalism means freedom. So neoliberalism is new freedoms, which sounds good, doesn't it, right? Who doesn't want more freedoms? But the catch is that although it's often presented as freedoms for ordinary people, freedoms for you and me, that's not really what it is. Neoliberalism is about freedom of money, right? Freedom to make money, freedom to maximize profits. So in other words, it's about freedoms for corporations and companies and businesses rather than about freedoms for us as citizens, even though it's often presented to us as setting us free. So how do corporations, how do businesses achieve these freedoms? What are those freedoms? Well, they get increased power over the way that we live our lives and the way that we think about themselves. That comes from a set of practices which have taken place over recent decades. So whilst the corporations and businesses have seen their power increase, that has come at the expense of decreased power for governments and us. So corporations have an increasing role in determining how we live our lives, and they're able to do that because of a set of processes. Like, for instance, what's called deregulation. So in other words, reducing the amount of regulation, the amount of rules and standards that businesses have to follow, so they have more freedom to do what they want. This is, for instance, why we're anticipating getting chlorinated chicken in from the United States soon, when previously it had been banned, right? We've deregulated, or we are going to deregulate that part of our food market. So that, and that will enable, American agricultural corporations to make more money. Similarly, the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, has agreed to the NHS selling NHS data, again, to American corporations. That's our health data, mine and yours included, being sold to American health insurance providers. And you could only think there's only one reason to do that, right? Which is ultimately going to enable them to sell health insurance here and thereby make money from us. So we see increased power for corporations, and the flip of that is decreased power for governments, and therefore people, being as governments are there supposedly to serve people. The other thing, another idea that characterizes, or another belief that characterizes this ideology, is the rule of the market. So the bottom bullet point here is society defined by markets, and linked to that is us people seen as consumers and entrepreneurs, not citizens. So the idea here is, with the rule of the market, that essentially that competition, right, competition to provide goods and services will maximize efficiency and therefore profits, and also create jobs, right? The idea that competition will create jobs and will create profits and will create efficiencies. Through the idea of competition. So we have, on the one hand, competition between employers, right, between companies, all wanting to maximize their efficiencies and their profits. So that's one element of competition. The other element is competition between us as people. We're all competing, and we see that word used, competing for jobs in the marketplace. So we compete with each other, we fight each other for jobs. So those are the characteristics of neoliberal ideology, right? It's about freedom to maximize profit and money making, often at the expense of the power and well-being of governments and people. So this is why we've seen these things over recent years. Reduced taxation, not for you and me, right, but for corporations. So you get, Amazon, Google, Apple, right, telling governments how much tax they're going to pay, right, rather than governments getting what they deem appropriate. We've all seen cuts to public services, right? Your libraries shut down, your Sure Start centres shut down. The fire service, fire stations have shut down. All these things have been cut because governments don't have as much money anymore because they haven't got as much tax income coming in. The rule of the market has seen the creation of new markets. So education, right, is now a marketplace. Schools are being run as businesses, right, under the name of academies. Universities, similarly, are being run as businesses, competing with each other. And the same in the health sector. So the NHS, for instance, is now made up of lots of different services, all set up as private enterprises, buying and selling from each other. One thing that means for us as individuals or as citizens is the promotion of individualization, right? So part of the ideology of neoliberalism is that we are independent, that we stand on our own 2 feet, that we are responsible for our own economic and personal and social well-being, rather than, for instance, being seen as part of communities or collectives. So that's a very brief introduction to neoliberalism. I would really urge you to spend a couple of minutes looking at George Monbiot's summary and explanation of neoliberalism that's on Moodle to get more of an explanation. But in summary, right, this is what we've established so far. So, sorry, that was a mistake. This isn't what we've established so far. We're now going to think more about this emphasis on individualization. So, in neoliberal ideology, uh, there's the promotion of a certain kind of person as the ideal, right? As the ideal citizen. And that person is adaptable, flexible, and productive so that they are able to make a contribution to the economy, right, through working and through consuming, in an environment which is characterized by casualization and productivity. So what that means is, on the one hand, lots of people, for instance, are on 0 hours contracts in Sports Direct or with Uber, right? Uber Eats or Deliveroo, all those kinds of things. Lots of people are on these 0 hour contracts, which is what we mean by casualization. You don't know when you're going to be working or how much work you're going to get or how much it's going to pay you, right? You don't have any permanence, right, in your employment. And yet at the same time, you face extremely demanding levels of productivity. So you're expected to be able to work very hard and very intensively, and yet in this casualized environment. And for that, you need to be adaptable, flexible, and productive. And so there's a kind of normative ideal promoted, right? You must be fit for work, you must be adaptable, you must be flexible, you must be productive. And so our sense of self and our sense of worth, and also how other people perceive us, is very much influenced by how well we match up to that ideal, right? How adaptive, flexible, productive we are. So neoliberalism demands a certain kind of person, and people who fail to live up to that normative ideal, people who are not adaptable, not flexible, not productive, or at least not perceived to be, face consequences, right? And very, very immense consequences, really. So rather than neoliberalism making everybody richer, which is what its advocates say will do, we've seen the opposite happen. Right? We've seen the rich get richer and we've seen the poor get poorer. So in this chart on the left-hand side here, what this is showing us is that the gap between the richest people in Britain, those are the blue dots, and the poorest people in Britain, those are the pink and red dots, has over the last 10 years grown. Right? So over the time that neoliberalism has really been ramped up under the guise of austerity, the gap between the rich and poor has grown, and it's grown in Britain more than anywhere else, even the US, look, which was a surprise to me. So people who cannot, for instance, get employment in the kind of marketplace that I've talked about face, welfare reductions, right? We've seen punitive benefits regimes introduced. We've seen people unable to work and yet getting insufficient benefits to be able to live off. And so that's why we've got currently 1 million people in Britain using food banks. It's why we've got 1 in 5 children in Britain living in poverty. And the underfunding, partly due to the privatisation of the National Health Service, is what led the Red Cross to declare a humanitarian emergency in that health service fairly recently, right? So these are the consequences of the neoliberal ideology. Now, who are the people who are most likely to be poor? Who are the most people who are most likely to find work difficult? Who are the people who are most likely to need food banks and the NHS? Well, disabled people, we know for a fact, are more likely to be out of work, more likely to be in low paid jobs if they do have a job than non-disabled people, much more likely. And so a significant amount of people using food banks are disabled people. A significant amount of people and children in poverty are disabled. A significant amount of people using the NHS are disabled. And so these are the consequences of neoliberalism for disabled people. The other consequence is a paradox. It's called Paradox 2 on the slide here because George Monbiot talks about the first paradox in his video. The paradox here that although it's meant to be about freedom, neoliberalism has actually resulted in a lot more surveillance and control, right, and authoritarianism over what we do. So in other words, rather than giving us more freedoms, it's taken freedoms away through various technologies of governance. In other words, technologies that help to govern, control what people do. And I'll show you some examples of that now. So we see increased surveillance and tracking, right? So for instance, workers in the Amazon warehouse have to wear a wristband that monitors their every movement, you know, a bit like a Fitbit type thing. But they've got managers monitoring, you know, how much they move, how much they work, when they take toilet breaks, you know, and they face sanctions, right, if they're deemed to be not working hard enough or going to the toilet too often or whatever it is. Monitoring and assessment. So education is increasingly set up to mold workers who will be, you know, flexible, adaptable, and productive, right? And a large part of the Ofsted regime is measuring how well pupils live up to those ideals. We see people who find it difficult to find work, particularly disabled people, facing punitive welfare regimes. In other words, benefits are being cut and cut further the longer that you're out of work. And also they're making it harder to claim those benefits in the first place. The government says that this is about encouraging people to go and find work, largely ignoring the fact that suitable jobs don't exist. But it's not the employers who have to bear the brunt of that, or the government that bears the brunt of that. It's the people who are unable to work for whatever reason. And as we've mentioned, you know, Uber or Deliveroo, Sports Direct, all these companies, many of them are now operating on this individualization and casualization of labour, which is again a labour marketplace that many people can't participate in. And we tend to, or have tended to, internalize those neoliberal values. We often judge our worth on our ability to contribute to the marketplace or to the economy. How ready for work are you? How productive are you? How flexible are you? And so on. The flip side of that is all the kind of, you know, corporate adverts and whatnot promoting this idea of individual freedoms and responsibility and self-worth, right? Those shampoo adverts that tell you you should buy it because you're worth it, right? Those kinds of things are the flip side of that individualization that's part of the ideology of neoliberalism. So What this means in practice is that neoliberalism fosters and enables ableist beliefs and disableist practices. Some of the consequences of that are that the legal right to inclusive education is not being met, right? So increasingly students are being segregated or excluded, or what's now being called off-rolled, particularly when, you know, the Ofsted inspector comes in, some kids are asked to stay away so they don't affect the report. We see that disabled people are much less likely to be in a job than non-disabled people, and if they are, it will be much more likely to be a low-paid job that still requires them to claim benefits or go to the food bank in order to have enough to pay the bills and eat. Not having enough money means inevitably a reduced quality of life, you know, access to community, to culture, to a social life, you know, as well as, you know, the basics for survival. That in turn has consequences in terms of poorer health, exacerbated by living in inadequate, you know, housing where the roof is leaking and you've got mice and rats coming in, right? Because the council, for instance, doesn't have the money to fix it, right? Because the tax hasn't come in that would enable them to have the money to do that. All the money's gone to the corporations instead. And as we noted in the last lecture, I think, increased prejudice and hate crime, right, towards disabled people. There's plenty of evidence of all of these things, as summarised in the series of recent Is Britain Fairer reports in recent years. And those ableist ideals. Testing 1, 2, 3. And those ableist ideals filter down into how the education system is organised as well. Those ableist attitudes and disableist practices filter down through to education, which has become in part largely about maximising profits for academy chains, more so than educating children. So what we'll do in the final lecture is try and bring all of this together and explore the concept of neoliberal ableism, which is the final of the 4 concepts which Dan Goodley puts forward in the first part of his book, which it's important to get to grips with for the rest of the year.